Today we're reading from Ruth 3, verse 1 to 9. One day, Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi, said to her, "My daughter, I must find a home for you, where you will be well provided for. Now, Boaz, with whose women you have worked, is a relative of ours. Tonight he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Wash, put on perfume, and get dressed in your best clothes. Then go down to the threshing floor, but don't let him know you are there until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, mark the place where he is lying. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do." "I will do whatever you say," Ruth answered. So she went down to the threshing floor and did everything her mother-in-law told her to do. And when Boaz had finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits, he went over to lie down at the far end of the grain pile. Ruth approached quietly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. In the middle of the night, something startled the man. He turned, and there was a woman lying at his feet. "Who are you?" he asked. "I am your servant Ruth," she said. "Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer of our family."
Well, good morning. There we go. I was thinking of a story this week, and then the more I thought about it, the more I realized how long ago it was. It's actually ancient history for most of you. It was 30 years ago, which amazes me. 30 years ago, I was in teacher's college, and I was just a baby teacher, just learning the trade, so to speak. And I had the opportunity to do my first and second teaching blocks at Jacob Beam in Beamsville. It was the elementary school that I attended. And so I got back there, and they have shrunk that place. It's amazing. It's, oh, is this not on? Hello? Test, test. Can you hear me now? Okay. Yeah, all right, good. Anyway, so yeah, they've shrunk the place. Like it's about a foot shorter, and the drinking fountains are way low. Anyway, I got a chance to meet my grade 1 teacher like years later, and as mortified as I am to share that this was 30 years ago, she was mortified that one of her grade 1 students is now in teacher's college teaching at the school where she was. And so anyway, it was an interesting opportunity, but I got a chance to teach grade 4 and deal with boots and coats and hats and mitts and all that stuff, and then I got to do a grade 7 placement, which was also fun. But one day I'm in the lunchroom, and then I hear a teacher coming in, and he's talking to other people, and he said, "Hey, listen, you've got a lunch coverage tomorrow. Why don't I take that for you and pick that up?" So tomorrow he's picking up a lunch coverage, and then there was some yard duty. I heard him picking up yard duty in the morning and afternoon, and I thought, well, this is great. This is the collegial spirit that we're looking for. People looking out for each other and just saying, "Hey, listen, you need a prep? How about I'll take your prep tomorrow so that you'll have some extra time." Anyway, all the teachers are smiling at me right now because they know what was going on. This person was going to be sick tomorrow, and they were going to call a supply teacher. And so why would you call a supply teacher in unless they had 8 periods to teach and 2 yard duties and a lunch coverage? So they're setting this poor sap up for who knows what. And I'm just watching them just kind of arrange for this guy's disaster day. And then the next day, it was Dave McMillan. Some of you know him. He comes into school, and so I'm eating lunch with him the next day, and I was like, "Hey, I was there yesterday when they were planning your execution." And he's like, "Yes, I noticed." But anyway, it was an alarming demonstration of like the opposite of a community kindness kind of working together. It isn't so much that it was an example of people misusing their position or their authority to their own advantage, as much as it was an example of people using someone else's lack of authority or lack of position to their disadvantage. They were making trades that somebody else never signed up for because there was nothing you could do about it. And it was kind of operated under the implicit assumption that everything that is bad for the outsider would then therefore be somehow good for us in the in-group. It was a disturbing thing, and I've never forgotten it. Have you ever been in a position like that? Have you ever been in a position where you've seen position or privilege being used to the group's advantage at the expense of an outsider? Well, on the contrary, the story that we're reading about here in the book of Ruth is quite the opposite. It is an amazing story of covenant faithfulness. And we've had a chance to learn about Elimelech and Boaz. And last week we talked about Naomi's transformation. And this week I want to focus a little bit on Ruth and Ruth's story through this whole thing. Our cultural distance between us and the text does get in the way. This story is a difficult one for us to understand because there's just some kind of cultural language and some cultural expectations that are kind of buried in the story that make it a little bit difficult to understand. So first, let's talk a little bit about what led up to this rendezvous that we're reading about in chapter 3. So if you've got a Bible, I invite you to turn to Ruth chapter 3 and have that handy. Now, initially in chapter 2 of the story, Ruth meets Boaz, it would seem, or it would appear, by accident. But I don't think it's an accident. I would prefer to think of that as more of a divine appointment. The Holy Spirit had set this up. And then she, Ruth, discovers later that Boaz is actually a close relative of her dead husband. And this guy has the opportunity through the Torah to resolve Naomi and Ruth's predicament. Now Boaz graciously provides for Ruth and looks after her in these verses that follow, but he never does offer to resolve the problem. And weeks go by. The whole barley harvest passes between chapter 2 and what we read this morning in chapter 3. Now look at verse 1 that Renee read for us this morning. Naomi says that she is looking to find a home. It says home in the NIV, or it says rest in the ESV, or it says security in the New American Standard. And what I find interesting is all three of these translations are good. They're a good effort at trying to draw out and trying to suss out the word that's there in the Hebrew. And so just as a Bible study technique, I want to encourage you, when you're reading a text and when you're studying the Bible, it helps to have a couple of different translations. And Bibles are great for this, or phone Bibles, because you can switch translations just with a click, and then look at a different translation of the same thing. And when you find a word that's getting rendered in a bunch of different ways, it's not that translations are untrustworthy or weak or somehow bad, but instead, what the translations are telling you is the Hebrew word behind the English is so big, it doesn't come through all in one channel. It's so big a word. It's so big a concept that it just has difficult being expressed in just one English word. All the subtext doesn't fit, and all the features of the word just somehow aren't captured. And I think that's what's happening here. The Hebrew word here is manoach, and it means a place, a rightful place, a secure place. That's what's coming through in this word. It's a place of permanence, a place of belonging. What Naomi is saying is, it's not like I'm looking to find you a flat. I'm not looking for a place to rent. But instead, what Naomi is saying, Ruth, we're just dangling here. We don't have position. We don't have, at least Ruth doesn't have, any rights of citizenship. And what Naomi says is, I feel obligated. I want to find you a place. I want to find you a space, a place of belonging, a place of security. Not just a house, but a home. And we're going to say more about that in a minute. Now with that in mind, a rightful, lawful place of belonging in mind, Naomi hatches this plan. The plan that she says in verse 3. Okay, here's what I want you to do, Ruth. And so imagine yourself taking this advice from your mother-in-law. Okay, you need to take a bath and use some nice smelling oil. So I don't know how that went over, but yeah, go do that. And then put on your best dress, it says in the NIV, and then go down to the threshing floor and scope out where Boaz is, but don't let him know you're there. Okay. Now, you might be forgiven if this sounds a little sus. It sounds like something's going on here, where Naomi's sending Ruth down to the threshing floor to hook up with Boaz. Is that what's going on here? Like, this doesn't sound like a Bible story. How can we be reading this to our kids? It might sound like there's an indecent proposal at work here, but that is not the case at all. Besides the context, there's a helpful word here, again, in the text that helps us sort of figure out what Naomi's intention or what her meaning is. That word there in verse 3, the NIV translates as best clothes. The ESV translates helpfully as cloak. And the Message just says, get dressed up. It's a Hebrew word, simla. And simla is used to describe your cloak. It's the outer garment that you would wear. Now, people that were poor might only have one cloak, one outer garment. It's not something you would wear to go to work. It's not something that you would get dirty, but it's like your nice clothes. You wear this over top of your underclothes. And if you were going to be spending a night sleeping under the stars, this is the outfit that you want because you can wrap it around yourself and keep warm overnight. That's what Naomi is telling him. And I think it helps if we look at another Bible story to kind of get an example of what's going on here. So there's a really interesting story in 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 20. And if you've got a Bible, flip over there for a minute while I try to set the table. Now, in 2 Samuel chapter 12, what's happening here is, of course, David has had his tryst with Bathsheba and has had Uriah killed, and Nathan has kind of blown the lid off the whole thing. And Nathan says this baby that Bathsheba is pregnant with that's going to be born, that baby's going to die. But David fasts and he prays solemnly for this baby's life. When the baby dies, his servants are almost reluctant to even tell him because they've seen how he's prayed and fasted, and they're frankly worried about what he would do when he finds out. And finally, David asks, is the baby dead? And his servants say, yes. And then what David does next surprises them. He gets up, takes a bath, puts on some sweet-smelling oil. He puts on his simla, his outer garment, and goes and has something to eat. David explains to his astonished attendants that the time of mourning, the time of grieving, is over. While the baby was alive, I prayed to the Lord for this baby's deliverance, but now that the baby is dead, the baby won't come to me. I will go to him. What David is saying is, the time for grieving is over. It's the same word. It's the same plan that Naomi gives to Ruth. It's time to stop wearing your widow's clothes. Ever since they'd arrived back in Bethlehem, they've been wearing black. They've been wearing the clothes of a widow. And these clothes were helpful in communicating things. They identified who they were. Hi, I'm a widow. I'm not attached right now, but I'm not looking for a husband. Thank you very much. Widow's clothes would explain why. She's on her way out to the threshing floor, and she's on her way to pick grain, unaccompanied by another male. It explained everything, and it answered all the questions, and it just made her life simple. It expressed a position in life that Ruth was taking. It's the place of a widow. But what Naomi is saying to Ruth here is, you need to say to Boaz, I am no longer mourning my husband, that I'm available for marriage. And then most boldly of all, what Naomi is suggesting is that she asks, would you be willing to serve as my kinsman redeemer, as my goel for my family? So that's another Hebrew word that's so big. It has so much meaning behind it. It has trouble coming through into the English. There's just so much behind it. So implied by the goel is is the idea that you are going to be a redeemer for a member of your family. Leviticus 25, verses 23 to 28. Let me read this. And we're going to talk more about these Torah teachings and how perhaps they might look today in the adult class this morning. The land must not be sold permanently, says the Lord, because the land is mine. And you reside in my land as foreigners and strangers. Throughout the land that you hold as a possession, you must provide for the redemption of the land. And then God explains, if one of your fellow Israelites becomes poor or has to sell their property, their nearest relative is to come and redeem what they've sold. If, however, there is no one to redeem it for them, but later on they prosper and acquire sufficient means to redeem it themselves, they are to determine the value of the years since it was sold and refund the balance to the one to whom they've sold it. They can then go back to their own property. But if they don't acquire the means to repay, what is sold will remain in the possession of the buyer until the year of Jubilee, when it will be returned back to their family. So this idea of buying back, of paying a family member's debts to get them out of slavery and to get them out of debt is implied by this idea of being a goel, being a related kinsman redeemer, a family hero, if you will. The law says some pretty amazing things here, that land is not a commodity. You can't buy land, you just use it. You buy the use of the land. That's big. And when a person has to abandon their place in the community, when they have to abandon what they hold because of poverty, there is a kinsman redeemer who can come along and restore them and bring them back. There's also, similarly, in Deuteronomy chapter 25, this idea of levirate marriage that we have talked about in the past. The law makes a concession for if a man is married and he dies without having given any offspring, his brother-in-law or a close family member is then supposed to marry the widow and get her pregnant so that an heir could be born to the family. And I know that's just whack to us today. But it reflected an attitude in their community that we don't want the name of any member of our community to just vanish. We don't want any families to fall between the cracks and disappear and be lost and forgotten. And in their culture, that was the way that was done. I know it's culturally strange, but what's being acted out in this story is of profound importance to the biblical narrative. Then a goel is a person that's closely related. It's a person who has wealth, who has the means to pay off debts and penalties at their own expense. A goel is a person who risks their own position to restore the place of the other. That's what a goel is. And does that sound like somebody that we know? Part of what makes this story so beautiful is not that it's a romance between two attractive people who it ends with a wedding and there's a baby and there's a happily ever after. You are confusing this with Disney. You're confusing this with a Hallmark story, and that's not what this is. What makes this story beautiful is it sounds like Jesus, doesn't it? It sounds like the Redeemer, our Redeemer at work. This sounds like something Jesus would do. This sounds like loving kindness, covenant faithfulness. This story resonates with the character of God. Our culture today does not naturally tell stories like this. We are more inclined to write and to listen and watch stories of redemptive violence. And so imagine if there was a blockbuster movie made about the story of Ruth. Ruth would be returning with Naomi to her dead husband's homestead, only to find an absurdly evil landlord somehow imperiously ruling over the property and making things miserable for everybody in town. This property that is rightly hers. And so then she would gather a band of rogues, misfits, and ne'er-do-wells, and there'd be a huge gunfight punctuated by some witty banter and maybe a pun or two before somebody gets offed. And then finally, the unintended, though inevitable, death of the primary antagonist. I feel like we could write that story right now. 90 minutes to 2 hours, maybe a car chase and big battle and explosions at the end. But this is not the story of uncommon faithfulness. Instead, what we read in Scripture is this story of Ruth. who has returned to Bethlehem with Naomi, putting her own future at risk, coming to a foreign country just to secure the safety of her mother-in-law, only to then have someone else save her. So Ruth goes to the threshing floor. As the farm celebrates a successful barley harvest, the grains have been dried and they've been threshed, which means they've been kind of beaten on the ground and then thrown into the air so that the chaff can blow away and the kernels, the grains, can then fall and be collected. Now, verse 7 in the story that we read this morning, you could be forgiven if you took the impression that Boaz is somehow just hammered and he's passed out beside a pile of grain. But he's not drunk. That's not what's happening here. Again, consider the context. The grain has been harvested. It's been collected and threshed. It's now ready. It's in piles there on the threshing floor. And so the practice was that the owner and their hired men would then sleep with the grain overnight until in the morning it could be then packed into sacks or packed into storage and then contained. They're there to protect their investment. And so they're sleeping on the threshing floor. Ruth figures out where Boaz is sleeping so that she can ask him a delicate question later that night. And so here's Naomi's plan. Ruth comes to Boaz at night and leaves before dawn in order to protect his dignity. What she's asking is bold. What Ruth is asking Boaz is, would you be willing to put your entire estate at risk by marrying me in order to restore my dead husband's name and his estate back into Israel? So she wanted to ask them when they were alone. She wanted to ask them in a way that he would not feel obligated to respond in any way. Because what she's asking is very delicate and very specific. As we mentioned a couple weeks ago, Ruth uses a careful and colorful play on words here. She throws back the edge of Boaz's garment and uncovers his feet and legs so that he'll wake up. And then she lays at his feet waiting. When he does, she asks him this really interesting question. Will you spread the corner of your garment over me? And again, the Hebrew word here is doing a lot of heavy lifting. That word corner is the Hebrew word kanaf. It's a word that means fringe. It means hem or trailing edge. But it also means wing. It is a word that's used to describe the refuge that Yahweh provides, to be under the shadow of his kanaf, his wing. But it's also a word that's associated with marriage. When a man marries a woman, he covers her with his garment. She places herself under his protection and within his name and his tribe. He secures her to the community. Ruth is asking Boaz if he would cover her up from the chill of that early spring morning. But she's also asking if he would take her and Naomi under his wing and assume responsibility for their safety through the protection described in the law. It's a bold and yet beautiful ask. An ask for help that comes with an uncommon level of faith. What she does here is remarkable. Ruth is the servant, whereas Boaz is the master. Ruth is just a visitor and a foreigner, whereas Boaz is a citizen of the country, a landowner. And in spite of all this, she almost doesn't ask him to marry her. She challenges him to marry her, granting the protection that a citizen would receive under the law. And Boaz is impressed. He's impressed that a Moabite knows this much about Torah law and knows the protections that are contained within the law. Boaz's response recognizes what Ruth's ultimate intentions have been all along. There's never intended to be any hanky-panky here. This is not something inappropriate, but rather what Ruth is doing is daring. It's bold, and it's faithful. It's a risky appeal for mercy in a way that truly honored Boaz and Naomi. She wanted to ask him in a way that he could say no and still save face. Boaz later in verse 10 says, "You are a worthy woman," says the ESV. "A woman of noble character," says the NIV. An Isha Khalil, a woman of strength, character, integrity, and substance. It's the same words that are used in Proverbs 31, verse 10. All along, Ruth could have found a husband back in Moab. That would have been easy. And even here in Israel, she could have just found a husband to provide for her needs and to provide for her protection. But instead, she risks everything in her future, and she risks her happiness in order to secure Naomi's place and Naomi's family, and in a way to bring her husband's name back from the dead. It's a beautiful story because Ruth is demonstrating the beautiful love that's rarely seen in the Bible outside of the actions of God. It's the word hesed, which means loving kindness. In verse 10, Boaz says, "The Lord bless you, my daughter. This kindness is greater than what you showed earlier," meaning accompanying Naomi back to Bethlehem. That was great. But what you're doing now is better because you haven't run after young men, either rich or poor. And this bright spot brings hope in the midst of a time of moral darkness. At the same time that the story of Ruth is happening, in other places in Israel, Samson is securing Israel's deliverance from the Philistines through wicked acts of hate and rage and revenge. God will achieve his will one way or the other, but God prefers to find it through acts of hesed. One writer reflected on the story of Ruth by saying, kindness is like a superpower. And in a sense, it kind of is. Kindness has a way of just breaking down barriers at school or at work or even within your family. Kindness has a way of just bringing down the temperature of a tense situation. Kindness has a way of expressing without words the kind of love and affection that we mean to have, but perhaps don't always feel. I think in our heart we know it's true, though sometimes we lack the courage to use this superpower. The characters in this story go about their lives seeking or just doing mundane tasks, seeking their ends, including their own survival and that of the family line, and yet somehow seemingly insignificant decisions and actions end up being powerfully transformative through the power of kindness. It costs nothing to be kind, though sometimes it does take courage. It costs nothing to be kind, like kindness towards someone who has hurt us or offended us. It's tough to be kind when you don't feel like the people that you're being kind to deserve it. It's tough to be kind, particularly when we're talking about people who are vulnerable and can't pay us back. Sometimes kindness is difficult, even though it doesn't necessarily cost anything. And what I want to make clear this morning is that we're not talking about social justice. We're not talking about social gospel here. We're talking about the gospel. There's nothing that's not gospel about this. We're ultimately saved through the actions of our kinsman redeemer, Jesus, who, although he was God, took on human form and became obedient to death, even death on a cross. Jesus paid our debt and secured our place in the world and restored our fellowship to God. Through faith, we are redeemed from sin and death, exactly the same as Ruth. And we have this opportunity, the same as Ruth, to respond in faith and provide the kindness that we've received from our Redeemer to others. Today, there's no place where this is more obvious than when we talk about the foreigner, the widow, and the orphan in our world today. Those who are longing for a place to belong, those who are looking for a place of security. Have you ever been somewhere and seen somebody that doesn't have a secure place? With the possible exception of Megan, and who knows, maybe a couple other people here, all of us have the benefits of Canadian citizenship. And I'm pretty confident you haven't thought about how powerful that is and how important that is. You should really read the inside page of your passport. It's really quite remarkable. This document says, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Canada requests in the name of Her Majesty, the Queen, I need to get a new passport, that all those whom may concern should allow the bearer to pass freely without delay or hindrance, and to afford the bearer such assistance and protection as may be necessary. What's really cool is this passport, or just citizenship in Canada in general, guarantees you entry to Canada. Internationally speaking, it's illegal for you not to be allowed to return to your country of origin. You're allowed to come back here anytime you want. And what's even better is you're allowed access to any Commonwealth country. It's kind of cool. It's like this club. And you can kind of go from any place to any place. You're provided a space and you're provided a place. We have the benefit of being received in any Commonwealth country and receiving assistance when we get there. There are many here in this country, and maybe they're here as students, or maybe they're here as temporary workers, or maybe they're here as refugees, and they don't enjoy that benefit. When I was down at Lipscomb in the U.S., they told me I had to have my A4 and had to have it clipped into my passport. I had to have it with me at all times because if some U.S. immigration officer popped out of the bushes on campus and wanted to see my papers, I'd have to be able to quickly just surrender them immediately to the person if they were checking. Now, it never happened, but it did make me a little bit nervous. The whole time I'm there, I'm realizing I don't have any right to be here. It was a weird feeling. I don't have any right to be here. Someone from the U.S. government could come to me and say, you need to be out of this country in 48 hours or you'll be detained. They could do it. They would not even have to explain why. The same way if I found you in my living room, I would tell you to leave, and you don't have any pretense of being there. Well, maybe you do. But citizenship guarantees us this place. It protects us in these certain ways. And there are people all over our world now that don't have that. There are more refugees right now in the world than have ever been since World War II. We embody and we act out hesed, this kind of loving kindness that God extends to us. And we have an opportunity to share that with others when we make space for others, when we provide for the safety of others, and when we use the privilege of our belonging to make it possible for other people to belong too. Redemptive love is not just something that we receive. It is something that we learn to practice.